So let's go ahead and get started. If you can take your seats, we'd appreciate it. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I'll serve as the host today. As a reminder, we are conducting this seminar in a hybrid format. So thrilled to have a full room here in the David Elwood Democracy Lab, as well as having so many friends joining us via Zoom. It is my pleasure to welcome Eyck Freymann for his talk, China Perspectives on Climate Geopolitics. Eyck Freymann is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Belfer Center's Arctic Initiative and the Columbia Harvard China and the World program, where he researches the geopolitics of climate change. He's also a non-resident research fellow with the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. His first book, One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World, was published by the Harvard Asia Center Press in 2020. His writings on U.S.-China relations and other current affair topics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, The Economist, Foreign Policy, and The Atlantic. As a reporter and columnist for The Wire China, he is also the author of The Warming War, a series of reports on the breakdown in climate diplomacy and its implications for the planet and the U.S.-China relationship. Eyck, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for showing up. It's such a pleasure to see such attendance at an in-person talk. I think I should ask for food to be served at all of my events. I've bitten off a big topic today. Ambitious, hopefully not too ambitious. I'm going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes at most, and then invite all of you to ask me difficult questions, cry out of outrage, tell me why I'm wrong, and hopefully we can have a productive conversation. What I'm going to try to do is organize this talk around a question, which is, how does the Chinese Communist Party think about the geopolitical implications of climate change? China, as we know, is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, emitting 30% of the global total, more than the entire OECD combined. And China's emissions are rising. China has pledged to peak its emissions by 2030, a target it seems likely to meet, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2060, a far more ambitious target. I think it's fair to say it's not clear to anyone whether China can or will meet it. The ambition is clearly there. The understanding of the gravity of the climate challenge is evident from everything that Chinese leaders have said about the topic over the past 15 years. And yet, relatively little is known about how Chinese elites conceptualize the challenge, and in particular, how they think about how climate change interacts with geopolitics. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. We know this from reading Chinese sources or listening to Chinese diplomats. It's also fundamentally an issue of China's development, and it will play out in the background over decades to come, overlaid upon the US-China rivalry and other geopolitical trends in the world. So it's vitally important to understand how these ideas intersect and are being operationalized in Chinese planning. What I'm going to try to do in a slightly simplified, but hopefully not too simplified way, is to give you a framework for thinking about how China understands the relationship between climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and their individual and collective relationship to geopolitics. I'm going to try to root this framework as much as possible in Chinese official sources, in Chinese language, but recognize that at times we need to go beyond the official sources and consult open sources to deepen our understanding of what China is actually thinking. The big picture takeaway is that China sees climate change through the lens of adaptation, security, and development. And China has developed over the past 10 to 15 years a quite sophisticated strategy for integrating these ideas. The goal is to maximize China's long-term development and security prospects. And the concept for how this is to be done is called building an ecological civilization, or a Shengtai Wenming. which Xi Jinping has described as the 1,000-year plan for the sustainable development of the Chinese nation. Ecological civilization incorporates elements of both mitigation and adaptation, but I argue subordinates mitigation to adaptation. At home, what does this mean? It means building system-level resilience first and foremost to all of the cascading impacts that climate change will bring about. And then abroad, it means thinking strategically about how the dominoes might fall and how China might exploit some of the indirect opportunities that are being created by climate impacts to further its own development goals. This requires tightening coordination across the party-state apparatus, and it requires integrating climate change thinking into existing policy frameworks, including basically every aspect of domestic and foreign policy. That's why the argument that I'm making is quite a strong one, that ecological civilization has become inseparable from basically anything China does that is oriented towards the long term. And then in the final part of the talk, I'm going to show how Chinese diplomats and investors have tried to integrate these ideas into their interactions with other states, essentially building geopolitical relationships, especially with small states that are exposed to significant climate change, based on a shared understanding of climate adaptation. And this you can think of as an attempt to globalize the idea, the intrinsically universal idea that is ecological security. I probably don't have to dwell too much on this for this energy policy group, but it's important to start by defining the difference between these two terms. There are two basic strategies for responding to climate change. Mitigation is essentially cutting emissions. It's human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. How do we slow climate change down, ideally stop it? And then adaptation is a much more open-ended concept because it's how we adjust our institutions and our practices to the actual or expected climate change that is coming. How do we, in other words, if mitigation is about preventing the unmanageable, adaptation is about managing the unpreventable. Xi Jinping has said, and this goes back to 2007, it's been in basically every significant Chinese statement and official document about climate change, that China regards mitigation and adaptation as complementary and equally important. Now that is, from a scientific point of view, a mature and sophisticated thing to say. I think most of the people who work on climate policy here at the Kennedy School would agree. China has called for the international community to incorporate more focus on adaptation into the multilateral climate change process, because China believes that on balance, especially in the 2010s, more than half of global focus was oriented towards cutting emissions as opposed to developing. China roots this view in its understanding of the 1992 Rio Treaty, which is the basis in international law upon which the entire global climate change diplomatic process is based. The Rio Treaty establishes a concept known as common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR, that essentially divides the countries of the world into two categories. It says developed economies created the climate change problem, it's their responsibility to fix it, and developing countries, being largely the victims of climate change, have the right to prioritize their own development and to prioritize adaptation. And it's up to the developed countries to provide the financing and the technological support to help the developing world decarbonize. So when China says that we regard mitigation and adaptation as equally important, they're making a statement in principle about how the world as a whole should regard the relationship between these two things. If you read Chinese documents, going back to the 2007 National Climate Change Program, this is the first official policy document that China ever published to articulate its state strategy on climate change. They make very clear that as a developing country, China is under no obligation to attach equal importance to these two things in the here and now. Indeed, this document describes mitigation as a long and arduous challenge for a developing country such as China, and says that adaptation is a more present and imminent task. Now, why is this the case? The document tells us, it tells us explicitly, no country has ever successfully developed from being a low-income society to a high-income society without emitting a very large amount of carbon and reaching, at the peak of development, a very high per capita level of emissions. So the argument is that China is justified under international law in prioritizing its development and adaptation. It will mitigate. It has international illegal obligations to mitigate, but it has no legal or moral obligation to do so right away. And in fact, there were academic documents that came out of this. I'll spare you some of the details because they get a bit technical, that note China actually has an interest in developing because the faster China develops, even if this means emitting a lot in the short term, the more effectively China will be able to decarbonize and adapt in the long term because it will be richer. It will have more technology, more resources to do it. Another crucial bit of this diagnosis is this idea that climate change will continue because a certain amount of it is just baked in. This is a quote from the National Strategy on Climate Change Adaptation, which I'll be quoting from a bit in this talk. It says, the warming of the climate system is expected to continue through the middle of this century, and the adverse effects and risks of climate change will continue to intensify. And China is warming faster than the world as a whole. This is regardless of what the world does on the mitigation side. And moreover, the risks that climate impacts pose to China and its development are compounding whatever happens on the mitigation side as well, because the climate risks that have already occurred will not be eliminated, and more potential risks are still accumulating. And moreover, these are going to continue even after the world peaks in its emissions and even after the world achieves carbon neutrality because of delays and feedback effects in the climate system that are well understood. So the conclusion, this is again quoting from the National Strategy on Climate Adaptation, is that China's ecological security and its sustainable development require China to build a basically climate resilient society. And the deadline for doing this, drumroll please, is 2035, 25 years before China has promised to achieve carbon neutrality, and only 5 years after it has pledged to peak its emissions. This is very clearly telling us how these two priorities are sequenced in time. The national strategy is over 100 pages long. It's extremely technical. It's fascinating. One of the most interesting observations in it is that what China should do is, because it can't prevent direct impacts from climate change from happening, it needs to invest in governance and system capacity to prevent contagion and spread. In other words, to isolate or quarantine the potential systemic effects of climate impacts at the location to prevent them from becoming systemic problems for China. And there's ideas about how this should be done in the financial system by de-risking the insurance industry. There's ideas about how this should be done with reducing the risk of social protests by relocating populations that live in at-risk areas, moving water around through the largest water transfer project in human history. I could go on. China is focusing very intently on climate adaptation, and Xi Jinping has personalized it because he has linked it to this concept of ecological civilization. It's a concept that predated his rise to power, but which he's appropriated. He now has a Xi Jinping thought on ecological civilization. He's written a book on the topic. Cadres across China are required to read it. It's been written into the constitution. And he has said, this is my vision for how we will essentially, remember, that's a 1,000-year vision for China's sustainable development. Figure out the resilience question first. And then next, think about how we can redirect our growth model to be sustainable and maximize our long-term potential economic activity in the context of a world being reshaped by climate change. In other words, recognizing that we are in the Anthropocene and that natural systems are now all intrinsically dependent on human behavior. Figure out the optimal balance of human activity, resource extraction, and so forth, and with natural systems. But the goal that is trying to be maximized, the factor that is trying to be maximized, is China's economic development and its geopolitical rise as well. Now, this is an enormous topic because it's been fleshed out in the literature on Chinese Marxism. Professors at the Marxism Institute at Peking University and other very elite state and party institutions have made clear that ecological civilization is the next stage of human civilization. It's supposed to represent the next stage of historical materialist progress, and it's linked to Marxist ideology. And the idea is it is intrinsically global. It is a gift that China has given to the world. But the problem is the Chinese state doesn't want to say this. They'll hint at it. The national strategy says we will integrate the requirements of climate change adaptation into the whole process of China's economic and social development. And we'll coordinate and strengthen adaptation actions in climate sensitive and vulnerable areas, regions, and populations, wherever they may be. That doesn't exclude climate adaptation to climate impacts that take place beyond China's borders. Just official sources will only hint at it for obvious reasons. They don't want to say this explicitly. So how is China actually thinking about this same basket of ideas, the importance of adapting, thinking about turning the development model to reflect a world being reshaped by climate change? How are they doing it outside their borders? Well, to understand how this part of the strategy works, we have to look at open sources. Now, there's problems with looking at open sources, and I'll spare you some of the discussion of the methodology. Clearly, open source is very widely in quality, and there's all kinds of interpretive issues in how you look at them. But if you were able to look at a very large sample of these sources, and you can take them from professors and experts at China's top universities and think tanks, and they show an extremely clear and coherent approach over time. And this approach is compatible with what the official sources are telling us, but just give us another level of detail and candor. And if they also align with the fact pattern of China's behavior, and the behavior of China's firms, and China's institutions like universities overseas, you can begin to make the case that this is an unwritten but widely shared and understood part of the national strategy. And in the second part of the talk, I want to walk you through what I think this global climate adaptation strategy is really about. China has become much more careful about communicating its thinking about this over the last 10 years. One of the reasons is that, as we know, international pressure on China to cut its emissions quicker has grown. And international reactions to China's economic activities, its foreign investment activities around the world, has also become more organized, more systematic, and more publicly prominent. So China has become more disciplined in how it talks about these things. However, this interview with the deputy director of the State Oceanic Administration, which was responsible for China's Arctic policy at the time, pretty clearly tells us how China is thinking about these issues. So this guy, Chang Lianzheng, said, in the future, it will be a common blessing for humanity to be able to use Antarctica in a peaceful way. This peaceful use, and he says, although the Antarctic Treaty has temporarily frozen the claims of relevant countries to Antarctica, it's banned the mining of Antarctica, clearly there is interest in what will happen when this agreement breaks down, which it will, both because of the progress of human economic development and because climate change will make it easier to get in and out of Antarctica and access these resources. And therefore, we should not be naive. Other countries are thinking the same way. There is open strife and veiled struggle where states are jockeying for this future that is going to come about that can be foreseen. It has not stopped for a moment. We only understand it better and better as our climate science improves, and China needs to be in the game. So according to Chen, the strategy has three basic parts or phases. In the first part, China's got to work on its climate science. It has to actually understand the mechanisms through which natural impacts are going to ripple through, and what that means for geopolitics, for resource extraction, for natural systems, for agricultural output, for public health. So it starts with climate science. And then China needs to get its foot in the door. And he calls this strengthening China's substantive presence. In the polar regions, China has had Antarctic facilities for some time doing scientific research. They have conducted limited scientific voyages in the Arctic, but they don't have presence because they're not a polar state. So the idea is by using comprehensive scientific expeditions, they can not only grow their knowledge, but actually develop a presence, ideally with a foothold like a port that is friendly, or a local country in the Arctic, which is willing to serve as China's proxy. And then the third and final stage of the strategy is that China will begin to participate actively in the governance of these regions and will establish a strategic position. And this is going to require both soft power and hard power. This is pretty clearly a geopolitical argument, right? And the State Oceanic Administration is fundamentally a scientific institution. This gives you a sense of how these two domains, civilian research activities and long-term geopolitical goals, are linked. Other Chinese analysts, Kang Wenzheng was a professor at the Central Party School. The others are all professors at leading Beijing institutions. They talk about how China can use a toolkit of investment diplomacy, with which we're pretty familiar by now, to get its foot in the door by finding a country that is willing to offer it that strategic foothold. One of these ideas is, how do you use the contradictions between the Arctic countries to pursue China's interests? How can you go to one country that is unhappy with what another country is doing and say, hey, we will help you. We will offer you private investment, civil society partnerships, scholarships to study at Chinese universities, funding for cultural events, just support for indigenous groups, scientific research collaboration. And through this, build a network of relationships that can develop over time into government ventures. There's an idea that politics, particularly anything national security related, has to be downplayed, because China is vulnerable in this sense. It's trying to get into a region where it has no presence, where its interest in getting in is going to inevitably bring about wariness and mistrust. There's a proposal that Chinese firms should build relationships with local populations and root them in shared values, playing down the obvious differences or conflicts of interest, and an idea that local governments are very important here, because China ultimately cannot get physical access to the locations that it wants unless the local governments are on board. So you start at the bottom at the community level, and you work your way up the pyramid to the political elites in the countries where you're trying to get in. And you try to present yourself as doing purely civilian activities, even though, as we can tell, this is not actually the plan. And the long-term plan is to convert those civilian relationships into something much more geopolitically significant. Through a process of elimination, Chinese analysts settle on Greenland as their most promising potential partner in the Arctic. And the reasons for this are pretty obvious. Apart from Russia and Sweden, which doesn't have Arctic coastline, you had Finland and 6 NATO allies. So the United States would have a lot of leverage to try to coerce or cajole these countries not to let China get an independent position. And Russia is very interested in China operating in the Arctic, with Russia as the gatekeeper, because Russia's whole concept is they will sell China their Arctic energy, and they will charge China tolls to use their Northern Sea route. So Russia has no interest in China getting independent positions. On the other hand, Greenland, which is a territory of Denmark, which has expressed by referendum its intention to become independent, but can't afford it, stands at the front line of global warming. It's sitting on the world's second largest resource of rare earth minerals and precious stones and iron and lots of other resources to boot. And this vast virgin land of ice and snow is opening up, as we can see. But private companies don't want to get involved because the timeline is too long. So if China can get in the door, the idea is they can facilitate or expedite the process of Greenlandic independence and turn Greenland into a friendly, pliable proxy state at a very strategic location in the middle of the Arctic, and also get preferential access to Greenland's resources. This strategy accelerates over the first few years of the 2010s as there's a commodity boom, and it looks like it could actually happen sooner than expected that these Greenlandic resources could come online. There's a receptive Greenlandic government, and China essentially goes all in, promising to buy all manner of unprofitable infrastructure in Greenland, boasting that it is unprofitable. And the fact that they're willing to buy it at a loss proves their long-term commitment. And Xi Jinping gives a speech where he says that China is going to soon become a polar great power, 极地强国, which is essentially coming out of the closet as having grandiose geopolitical ambitions in the region and calculating that because the tide of history is behind it and Greenland is willing, there's nothing at this point that the Americans and the Russians can do to stop it. There's also discussion of the Arctic as a strategic new frontier. Other strategic new frontiers are cyberspace, outer space, and the deep sea. They're new because they're unexplored, because they have resources or geopolitical value. But the Arctic is the only actual region of the terrestrial world that's listed in this category. What is so new about the Arctic? The Arctic has always been there? Well, the answer is climate change. Climate change is new. This process continues as these deals are negotiated. A Chinese mining company tries to buy an abandoned naval base on the Greenlandic coast, which it's impossible to connect geographically to the mines that they want to operate. The Chinese government comes in with maps that they've produced, the highest quality maps of Greenland ever created, and they offer them to the Greenlandic government for free. Scientific advisors, tourists start coming to Nuuk. It seems that this partnership is on the verge of being formalized. But then in 2018, China is taken by surprise. It turns out one of the mines they wanted to operate, which is going to produce mainly rare earths, also produces trace quantities of uranium. There's local resistance, which is probably fomented by the Americans and the Danes. And all of a sudden, Greenlandic politics turns and China's deals all fall apart. The State Council is not deterred. And the same year, they release a document, a white paper, the first document ever to articulate their strategy for a region of the world in this way, that is opening the door to some extremely expansive future Arctic claims. Now, on what basis is the State Council making these claims? China is not an Arctic state, right? It never has been. Well, here is their justification. These are the opening lines of this document. Global warming in recent years has accelerated the melting of ice and snow in the Arctic, right? And as a result of climate change and its cascading effects, the Arctic situation now goes beyond its original inter-Arctic states or regional nature because it has a vital bearing on the interests of states outside the region. In other words, because climate change is affecting this region, China has a right to a stake in it. You can apply this logic anywhere in the world that's affected by climate change. But the first region for which this is articulated explicitly is the Arctic. Now, why does China do this, knowing that other Arctic states will respond negatively? Knowing that the United States is already beginning to figure out what China's up to. And the answer is Chinese analysts believe that they are destined to get what they want because of structural trends in the international system. We're told not only that Greenland is still going to be the first sovereign state created by climate change, but also that it's longing for the bankroller, and it's longing for something that only China can provide, because what Greenland wants is independence. And that means its interests are intrinsically in contradiction with the Danes and the Americans. And the Greenlanders have never had leverage to push for this before, but now they do, because now climate change has established their value. Therefore, they predict, Greenland has learned that it can use China to obtain bargaining chips and will keep doing this, inviting China to bid, to cooperate on scientific projects, to establish a presence in Greenland, to make deals, if only to get the Americans and the Danes to pony up more. And eventually, when Greenland becomes an independent state, it's going to lean towards China because it wants to hedge its dependence on its traditional patrons. So in conclusion, Greenland is still in a good position to realize mutual benefits. And this strategy is tied in for the first time in 2020 to the Belt and Road Initiative. But it goes beyond this, because China's interest in Greenland has a distinctive strategic military component as well. Greenland in 2020 is described as a potential Chinese strategic strong point or strategic pivot point. The authors who describe this are two very influential Arctic experts at Beijing International Studies University. And this is not an insignificant observation, because in the Chinese lexicon, strategic strong points are a very big deal for the future of the People's Liberation Army. Strategic strongpoints are defined according to the core doctrinal text of the PLA as locations that provide support for overseas military operations or act as a forward base for deploying military forces overseas. In peacetime, they're essentially friendly ports, but they have this intrinsic dual use function. And in some kind of conflict situation, the idea is China would retain some kind of access, and that would allow China to maintain its presence in the region where it's so interested in having presence. China's strategy for countries that are named as strategic strongpoints is to pursue what is called all-around strategic docking, which is a euphemism for a lock-in of political relations so that the country is not going to abandon China in China's potential moment of crisis. It's not just in the Arctic that China is thinking about turning climate vulnerable states into strategic strongpoints. The exact same logic applies to countries that have the opposite situation as Greenland, countries which are on the verge of existential climate danger. Kang Wenjung, the same guy from the Central Party School, who pointed out that China should get into Greenland by exploiting contradictions between Greenland and the US, notes that China can help low-lying island countries build artificial islands and other infrastructure like ports that they need to continue operating and maintaining functional economies in the context of climate change. And in return, they'll add pivot points to the Belt and Road. The problem is, from the perspective of these low-lying island countries, unlike Greenland, which sees itself as an appreciating commodity as climate change plays out, a country that anticipates that it could be underwater in a few decades' time doesn't have the luxury of waiting around. It needs support with adaptation. And if we go back to our original understanding of how China conceptualizes adaptation, it's not just building resilience to direct impacts, the natural disaster, the flood. It's redirecting your entire model of governance and society in such a way that you can continue to grow and benefit and thrive in a world reshaped by climate change. So it goes beyond infrastructure that you would think of as being climate adaptation infrastructure, like a seawall. It encompasses basically everything. And the fact that China is able to build this infrastructure in countries which have very little leverage to say no means that China will inevitably, if it pursues this in lots of small islands, be able to build a fair number of these strategic pivot ports. This is not just coming from scholars in the academy. You can take this straight from the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, the institution that is in charge of China's domestic adaptation efforts. An internal think tank produced the following study. These countries in the South Pacific and the Caribbean are exposed to the impacts of climate change. They're facing existential threats. And guess what China can offer them? You can offer them infrastructure, climate observation and early warning, healthcare, financial and technical support, support developing natural resources, and food security. In other words, China can become an all-around strategic insurance policy for one of these countries, which is looking for external support because it can't meet those needs itself. And if the United States is not in the game, if international institutions are not in the game and focusing on adaptation as well as mitigation, well, guess what? At least a few of these countries are likely to go over to the Chinese side, and China will get the strategic access that it wants to operate in those regions. To take just one example, we can look at Kiribati. It's one of the least developed countries in the Pacific. It's a country of about 120,000 people. Most of it is extremely low-lying, vulnerable to storm surges. It's got population it's got very small population. Its geography, it's like a quarter of the size of Rhode Island in an archipelago spread out across an amount of ocean the size of Alaska, which means it's not easy to protect against climate impacts. Obviously, they can't adapt without external help. But in 2018, you have a president elected who says, I have a national adaptation plan. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to raise the big island. We're going to build 5-star resorts. We're going to build an elevated highway all around the island. We're going to shore up all of our infrastructure with seawalls and new water systems. We're not going to have to abandon our homeland, as my predecessor said. Everything will be good because we'll get billions of dollars of foreign investment, and will be able to adapt and thrive in this new warming world. The following year, he goes to Beijing. He signs an agreement with Xi Jinping to switch Kiribati's recognition from Beijing to Taipei. He goes home with a number of Chinese investments, gifts, ferry boats, airplanes for the airline. He spends the day with Xi Jinping. He comes away very happy indeed. And just a couple of years later, it's reported that China is beginning to build an airstrip. A luxury hotel at one of the most remote islands in Kiribati, very, very close to Pearl Harbor, actually, where US Indo-Pacific Command is based. And this quote unquote luxury hotel can be easily modified in the future to support Chinese Y-8 patrol aircraft. The Biden administration is extremely concerned about this. Kurt Campbell, the Biden administration's Asia czar, has said that China's next moves on overseas basing are likely to be in the Pacific. We saw this last year with a major agreement between China and the Solomon Islands, another climate vulnerable state. Negotiations continue with Kiribati, and I would not be surprised if we see more of this in the years to come. It's just extra convenient from China's perspective that some of the last countries on Earth that still recognize Taiwan happen to be in this region and extremely vulnerable to climate change as well. To wrap up, just to summarize what we've taken from here, we've traced Chinese thinking on climate change and geopolitics as it emerged and developed over about 15 years from 2007 to the present. And I've argued that there is a consistent and a highly coherent worldview about what kinds of challenges climate change poses and how China can further its national interests by adapting to them. And that this worldview is both very smart and very different from our own. This concept of ecological civilization is pitched in propaganda to foreign audiences like a Chinese form of environmentalism with Chinese characteristics. But if you look at what the experts at the Institutes of Marxism are saying, they are emphatic that ecological civilization is totally different from a Western conservation-heavy focus on environmental protection. The idea is how China can sustain the fastest possible economic growth for the longest possible amount of time to achieve its goals of national rejuvenation, which involves becoming powerful as well as rich. And in the process, to develop a concept of statecraft and society for the Anthropocene that will be China's contribution to the world and will legitimize China's attempts to insert itself into governance conversations in regions of the world where it currently is not present. The strategy starts at home, of course. China faces real risks from climate change domestically, and the party state is well aware of them. Climate change impacts threaten China's territorial integrity by potentially submerging strategic islands in the South China Sea from which China claims territorial ownership of large amounts of that body of water. It threatens Chinese urban populations. It threatens the financial system. It threatens public health. All of this is laid out in the national strategy. China is deeply aware of how big a security threat climate change is, because it cuts to the heart of China's concept, which is to develop first. Climate change, as the National Climate Change Program said in 2007, is fundamentally not an environmental issue. It's a development issue. And China still thinks of itself as a developing country. Aggressive mitigation will come. This has been made very clear in Xi Jinping's statements and in the scholarly literature on ecological civilization. But it will come when it begins to serve the purpose of advancing China's development and security goals rather than retarding them. And while China is moving towards that moment and will hopefully arrive there sooner rather than later, they're not quite there yet. And so in the meantime, Xi Jinping has made clear coal needs to remain the primary basis of China's energy mix. In the meantime, as China gets its own house in order and works towards this 2035 deadline to make itself a climate resilient society, it's increasingly proposing partnerships with small climate vulnerable countries around the world. And its goal here is to establish relationships that it will convert over time into presence, which it will convert over time into a voice in governance. And the polar regions came first. This playbook is globally applicable. We can see it spreading in the South Pacific. There's evidence that China wants to pursue it in the Caribbean. And while you would have to reimagine how it would work in regions like the Sahel or South Asia, I think it's probably inevitable that similar concepts will be applied there too. What does this mean for the United States? It means the good news is China does plan to cut its emissions and to cut them to zero, and that this is baked into the cake of Xi Jinping thought. And so in a sense, that is good news. We can probably truncate our worst case scenarios for what global emissions might look like. China is very serious about creating a world where ecological systems don't collapse. They think that's a threat to their development model, and they're determined not to let that happen. On the other hand, China is very, very keenly focused on reducing its own vulnerabilities to climate risk, and is doing so in a more systematic and ambitious fashion than the United States is doing, or might even be capable of doing because of our federal system. And then finally, China is looking systematically at how it can take advantage of climate change impacts overseas. And it's often finding willing partners, because it's simply correct that China's interests overlap with small countries that need adaptation assistance and that can't do it alone. So in closing, I would suggest the United States does not really have an option here. If China is committed to thinking about adaptation as a race, the United States has to start running, and we have to be prepared to win. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eyck. Let me start with the first question, and then we'll pass around the mic for others here. So you mentioned how China, in the context of the climate negotiations, has historically viewed itself as a developing country. They typically negotiated as a part of G77 in China in the UN climate talks. But I think we've seen also an evolution over time where there's some developing countries look at China and say, you're not a developing country like we are. Certainly, if we go back to like Copenhagen in 2009, there was pressure from some of these small island states for some of the big emerging economies to do more in terms of cutting their emissions, or at least demonstrating a willingness to cut emissions than we'd seen in previous climate talks. And I think that kind of set the stage for the evolution we've seen in the international climate framework that we now have under Paris, where countries do have these emission goals that you mentioned in the context of China. So I'm wondering, to what extent does what China is doing on all these efforts, engaging one-on-one with other countries, do they see themselves in any way constrained or influenced by the international climate negotiations? Do they think of it as it's just something else they have to manage over here? And at the end of the day, they're just going to do what is in their interest in each one of these cases? And if that's the case, I'm also curious your thoughts about what the recent economic conditions in China mean for the availability of resources to be able to deliver on some of these partnerships they're trying to build.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's a great question. The geopolitics of mitigation are complex and they're controversial. And I couldn't do them justice in a 45-minute talk and also present this, which I think is fresher. So you'll forgive me for having skipped it, but let me try to sum up the key points. Yes, China became aware around the time of Copenhagen, which is in 2009, when China was blamed by the developed countries and by most of the international press for having stonewalled the negotiations and treated them with disrespect. There was growing concern in China after this moment that China may have overplayed its hand, because developing countries were beginning to question whether China ought to be thought of as a developing country and really ought to have some kind of responsibilities to cut, just given the size and scale and the fact that there's just no way to reconcile continued rising Chinese emissions with a 1.5 degree goal. There was a literature that started around 2009. It's associated by this guy named Zhang Haibin, who's at Peking University, who later has been the lead author of many Chinese government reports on this topic. So we know he's the real deal. And he notes that there is a geopolitics of mitigation, there's a geopolitics of adaptation, and they're connected. And on the geopolitics of mitigation, China's interests are to keep the developing world unified as a bloc behind this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And the reason is, if that bloc falls apart, China will find itself inevitably targeted by the United States and other developed countries that view China as a competitor and say, hey, you have to cut your emissions or we will force you to, probably by means of some carbon tax or carbon border adjustment mechanism. And various economists at the State Council ran the numbers and they said, this is a disaster because the cheapest way for us to develop, the only way for us to maximize our development is to burn coal, a lot of it, through the early 2030s at least. And so we need to head off this risk. This is a risk to our development. And therefore, we should show the world that we're participating as a good faith actor, that we're willing to make some commitments. We should try to persuade the world that we are actually serious about when we say that we plan to go carbon neutral in the longer term after we've developed. We just haven't developed yet. And that is what the 30-60 goals are saying. They're saying our development will begin to slow around 2030 structurally. And that is when we will be rich enough and technologically advanced enough that we'll be able to start scaling up renewables and phasing out coal. And then by 2060, which is far enough away to be kind of analytically impossible to assess, we will achieve net zero emissions. And that proved pretty effective because the Obama administration was interested in a partnership with China. It was willing to accept a bilateral agreement with Xi Jinping in 2014, in which China agreed to peak in the future and the US agreed to much stricter cuts. And the US was willing in the process to reiterate that it accepted the principle of CBDR. And so this was great news for China. And China always reminds the US when they're fighting about the mitigation diplomacy piece, you acceded to CBDR in Rio, and you have acceded to CBDR again at every COP where you've signed the joint declaration. So you have said, and you keep saying, that we're under no obligations to cut because we're a developing country. So why are you then trying to use your soft power and your propaganda to make us look like the bad guy? It's not a perfect approach because the reality is China's emissions continue to rise. But how can China deal with this? They can do it by doing just enough on the mitigation side that they can head off organized retaliation. And in the meantime, they can try to keep their developing country coalition together by offering them assistance on the energy side and the adaptation side.
Do they have the resources to do that?
Well, China is in the process of a very rapid economic slowdown, which I think is belied by what looks like a very impressive growth number this year because of just the truly awful base effects of COVID. The reality is their model of growth through building debt-funded infrastructure has probably run its course, and their financial system is beginning to creak under the load of debt. And meanwhile, we have this question because COVID completely messed up the finances of a lot of developing countries, which now can't pay back their Belt and Road loans. And many low-income countries are in limbo as they renegotiate those debts, try to restructure them with the Paris Club of Western lenders and big development banks in China. And so until that is resolved, no one is really lending anymore. Everyone is waiting until they see who gets paid back and how much. China doesn't know, is it going to lose 500 billion on the Belt and Road or 200 billion or less? And if they play their hand well because of how they wrote the contract, they're probably going to get paid back in full by most of their debtors. But until this situation is figured out, you've got Chinese banks, they don't know, should they write this off as 500 billion or 200 billion? And in that context, they're not going to lend more. So we're in a holding pattern now. But structurally, if Xi Jinping thought is really so central to how the Chinese system is thinking about this issue, right? And the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which is working on the adaptation piece so ambitiously domestically, is thinking about this as the international aspect of what they're doing. I think it's inevitable because it's just not that expensive to help a country like Kiribati shore itself up. What it really takes is diplomatic effort, not money.
Thank you. So my name is Javed Yunus, and I'm the visiting for 2 days here. I'm from Pakistan.
Mhm.
So just 2, 3 points on your talks. One is, as we say, that supply has to meet demand to make a happy transaction, right? I mean, Chinese have coals, others have coals, and coal is the cheapest source of producing electricity, while the fossil fuels are very expensive mix for producing electricity. India, for example, produces 70% of its electricity from coal. So I just wonder how could really we make China not to do that when there is a demand by the developing countries to make a partnership with China when they're going through very tough times, like developing countries, especially with the petrol prices and all that. So yeah, there is the climate ramifications, but it's not just about the coal. The climate can be fixed by some other sides too, but coal definitely is one of the major ones. But, so what can be done in that case when there is both supply and demand and both are happy with that? That's cheaper source. And second is this that while look, the Chinese have surplus of labor and they can export labor to wherever, like they are happy to go to Arctic or Africa or Pakistan. I see Chinese in the streets of Pakistan, right? They are doing work hand in hand. So what I'm trying to say is this, that China looks like has built a kind of a trust by not only just giving money, but also giving labor and capital who are actually seen working on ground, but we hardly see at least the labor coming from Europe or let's say from America, really working in Africa to create that kind of impact, like people to people. So, I mean, and then Chinese strategy is kind of seems like very, very practical, very different, right, compared to the strategy of the West, where we only gave aid, and we didn't really question about the use of aid as such. And here are Chinese giving you loans and making a contract and building whatever. You could see that.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, under these kind of scenarios, what do you think West can do better to create kind of the development impact or trust in comparison to what China is doing?
Well, it's a good question, and the logic as it's laid out in the study I could go back to is this, which is that Lee et al. It's an internal think tank within the Ministry of Ecology and Environment who studied partner countries, recipient countries' reactions to the aid and investment China was giving, and asked, how can China get a better bang for its buck in terms of soft power for the energy and climate related investments that it's making? And the conclusion that they came to was pretty scathing, because it says, they concluded essentially China is pushing green energy, low carbon energy projects onto very, very small, very, very climate vulnerable countries that are basically a negligible share of global emissions. And this is not what these countries want. They don't want necessarily to be carbon neutral. Maybe that they do in theory, but they're most interested with this survival problem, this existential threat problem. And therefore, China should give them what they are asking for, which is by and large adaptation infrastructure. And adaptation infrastructure, as I said, is not just a seawall. It's when you're vulnerable to climate change, if you're a small island, you need everything built new. All of your housing, all of your power grid, all of your water infrastructure. You need solutions for saltwater contamination in the food system. You have to rethink your whole infrastructure. And so China should be going to countries that need help with that kind of thing, which is often not encouraged by NGOs that want to be exporting clean energy to the developing world and say, look, we will meet you on what you want. Ask us what you want and you can have it. And I think the policy recommendation for an organization like USAID would be, we should be doing the same thing. We shouldn't be trying to build solar farms in the Pacific Islands. We should be recognizing that countries that face existential threat are not interested in solar panels. They're interested in the infrastructure they need to stay in their homeland. And part of that involves technological exchange, helping countries do early warning for natural disasters, but a lot of it is just capital. because private capital doesn't want to go into places that are going to be underwater in a few decades' time. Yeah. Could we take another question?
Hi, so I have a question. What can Americans do? You have Republican Americans who want to give less money to foreign countries, not understanding how little we actually do give. Then they've never heard of countries like Kiribati. So how do you convince them this country they've never heard of in the Pacific Ocean needs our help and why it's so critical and the impact of the Chinese who they already hate? So, how do you deal with the American Republican mentality and this problem? Because it's not a simple hurdle to get the Americans to give money. Like, it sounds great. Yes, the Americans absolutely should give money. But how do you convince the Republicans who don't want to give a penny that this is so, it's actually brilliant by the Chinese, right? They found the sexy topic of climate change. Oh, and by the way, add into the fact that the Republicans don't even believe climate change exists. So how do you convince the Americans? I think it's brilliant by the Chinese.
So for my book, I actually interviewed many of these Republicans. And what's interesting is that there are hardly any climate deniers left in the Republican Party. Hardly any elected officials who are still actually climate deniers. And basically no one in the Republican policy space. I won't get into recapitulating their argument, which is cynical to say the least. But they're very open to the need to adapt. In fact, the first governor in the United States to appoint a chief resilience officer for the state was Ron DeSantis in Florida. Ron DeSantis has boasted that no other governor in the country is doing more on adaptation and resilience than he is. That's the Republican view in a nutshell. Development first. It's more similar to the Chinese perspective. We need to develop first, and we'll have more technology and resources to adapt in the future. And we can adapt to many, though not all, of the impacts and contain their systemic risks. And the market will take care of a certain amount of that for us, but the state has a place to intervene in a limited way. And there are many people in the Republican Party, former Trump administration, national security officials, and so forth, who I interviewed and I pitched them this, and they said, oh yeah, if Kiribati needs a loan so they don't have to take a Chinese port, let's give them a loan. So there is, I think, an openness in the Republican Party to do this kind of partnership, but to do it with a national security focus, to do it via, say, the Department of Defense. And the exchange would be, we want the same thing that China wants. We will give you the support you need to adapt, but we want strategic access in return. I actually don't think there's that much daylight between Democrats and Republicans in how they would operationalize this. And one of the ways you can tell this is that the Trump and Biden administrations handled the Greenland issue in almost exactly the same way. But they've also handled the Pacific Islands in a very, very similar way. And we saw this just this year when the Biden administration renegotiated its access agreements, which give unlimited military access to the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands in exchange for funding. That's what we're doing. We're helping these countries build climate resilience, and in exchange, we're locking in a certain number of decades of exclusive military access. So this is the new game that is being played. It's just visible to see in the Pacific because these countries are so small and it's relatively cheap to do it. This dynamic is going to take a different form in much bigger and more populous countries like those in South Asia. But I think the logic of it is intrinsically not regionally confined. And so we should be thinking creatively about what that means for our aid and diplomatic relationships all over the world.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Kevin. I'm Chinese and I work on climate. So you noted that China has successfully built some of these trusting transactional relationships with regions like Greenland, Solomon Islands, et cetera. And then you also see that the US is reacting by, for example, opening an embassy in the Solomon Islands and adding more of a green finance, climate resilient infrastructure aspect to these new partnerships between US and Africa, US and APEC Pacific countries, islands, et cetera. So my question for you is, in these different local contexts, are we going to expect a rise in conflicts in terms of doing business with these local countries, and US's reaction to China's aggression in these local contexts? Do you think it's at the current scale, at the current status, effective in terms of its scale and its reaction speed to make an effective counter offer to what China is pledging to these small countries?
It's a very good question. It's a hard question to assess because if you've read The Hound of the Baskervilles, Sherlock Holmes solves the case because of the dog that didn't bark, right? China is making efforts to expand its overseas basing all over the world, and only a few of these cases have burst into the public eye. Equatorial Guinea is one, right? Vanuatu is another. And these generated headlines in the New York Times, and then they sort of faded away. And they didn't fade away by accident. They faded away because US diplomacy got to work. So we don't know how large the universe of cases is where China has tried this playbook. And we don't know how much further it can dial up the activity that it's already doing. What we do know is that China's been relatively unsuccessful so far at finding small island states that are willing to go all in. Last summer, Wang Yi, the former foreign minister, made a trip where he stopped in nearly all of the Pacific Islands and essentially offered them the deal that the Solomons took, where China will provide all-around assistance, right? China wants access to a port, climate adaptation support, as well as a whole host of other activities, infrastructure, undersea fiber optic cables, all this stuff. And the cost is you have to sort of lock in, do the comprehensive strategic docking to China. And he made this pitch to 11 or 12 countries in the Pacific Island community. And only the Solomons said yes. And Kiribati is leaning towards yes, but the US has so far restrained them from doing that. So you could argue that whatever the US is doing has been effective. But on the other hand, you could say China has only very recently, really during the pandemic, begun to systematize this playbook. And it's still early innings, all right? And they're still focused on their domestic resilience first. And though much depends on the future of the Chinese economy, if China succeeds, whatever this means, in building a climate adapted society within China by 2035, and America has not, China is going to be looking much better as a partner and a provider for this kind of support because they actually did it themselves. So I think it's important not to be complacent about this. The early signs are optimistic. I think in terms of hoping for the best for these countries, which are in a vulnerable position because of no fault of their own, there is a moral obligation to provide aid, adaptation, resilience support. But I think because of this analysis, there is increasingly a way that the US can justify this case on national security grounds alone. And I think this is going to make it harder for countries that want to play both sides to do so in the long term. Because the US, like China, is going to say, like the Biden administration said to Micronesia and the Marshalls, you can have the support you need. And it looks like Micronesia is even going to get a visit from Biden. It's the first time a US president has ever been there, right? It shows how serious it is. We will give you a lot in terms of love and attention and money, but we need to lock in that relationship because we can't give you this now and let you have the opportunity to go to China in 12 months and say, what do you got? So countries will have to choose which side they want to fall on. And it's not clear whether or not these countries will benefit in the process. But China only has to get a couple on side to expand its global basing. And that in the long term would be pretty significant for the PLA Navy and its ability to fight a war in the Pacific, for example. So this is a story to watch very closely.
Thank you so much. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for the informative talk. My question builds on your previous answer about Chinese banks being in a hold and wait mode with respect to giving more loans to developing countries. So recently, we've seen some tension between developing countries and China about restructuring Chinese debt given the debt distress. So, for example, Ghana and Sri Lanka both publicly criticized China for being stringent about debt relief compared to Paris Club. I wonder if we would see this, if this instance of tension would result in the future in some kind of lack of popularity of engaging in economic ties with China for developing countries, or if it would result in changes in China's geopolitical targets with respect to, in general, giving development loans, or in particular climate adaptation loans to developing countries.
That's a good question. And that's a question that I asked myself when I was doing my first book about the Belt and Road. At some point, countries have to see that what China's peddling is, if not one-sided, definitely serving China's geopolitical interests. At what point does that make them not want to say yes anymore? And I remember having a conversation with Graham Allison about this. And in classic Graham fashion, he just thinks for a moment. He says, well, money is green. The idea being that if you're willing to put cash on the table, a developing country is usually going to have a very hard time saying no. The question is, how much money is China realistically going to be able to put on the table? And the answer may well be much less than in the heyday of the Belt and Road before the pandemic. But it's also possible that they deploy that money, that smaller pot of money, in much smarter ways by listening more to what their partners want, rather than coming in and slamming an 800-page pre-written proposal on the table and say, hey, we would like to build this, port city in the middle of undeveloped wilderness. We want to listen to you. What aid would you like? What infrastructure do you need to build that you can't get funded any other way? We're here to help. There's ways that you can leverage a smaller amount of money in smarter ways, because it doesn't ultimately cost very much to buy off one of these Pacific islands. It's much more a question of how you deploy the money and how you lock in your relationships with political actors in those places. We have seen pushback against the Belt and Road or Chinese lending all over the world. It's clearly a phenomenon. I think it's probably been overstated, because in any country with multiple parties, where China's coming in and making a deal with the ruling party that's going to result in them getting lots of money and investment to disperse to their patronage network, the opposition party is going to say, hey, China's making a deal with the leadership to stay in power, so China's corrupt and they're evil and they're bad. And they'll criticize the projects as being poorly thought out. But then if there's a transfer of power and they become in power themselves, well, guess what? The logic starts to work in their favor, and they renegotiate it. And they do a cosmetic renegotiation to make it work for their own political economy. And then they're actually just as invested as they were before. And we've seen this dynamic in lots of African countries, where China's become skilled at managing transitions of power. So I would not be optimistic that this will die out of its own accord. I think it demands a US and a global response.
Last question.
Okay, thank you so much for a great presentation. My question is, China also dominated in the global supply chain in some environmental goods, like wind turbine and solar panel, and including the supply chain to the US and the EU countries. I think China also completely opened the largest greenhouse gas emission mitigation market for the green tech imported from the US and from EU countries. So how do you think these green goods, green tech trade and supply chain impact on this, like particularly China, US, the geostrategic, geopolitical relations, the bilateral or international? Thank you.
If we zoom far out from the conversation we've been having about the Pacific Islands, and we get back to China's very big picture concept for responding to climate change, which is they call ecological civilization, which is integrating mitigation and adaptation into a same philosophy but really leaning towards adaptation in the process. I think it's clear that if you can foresee in the future a global energy transition taking place, that's going to create obvious industrial opportunities because there's going to be massive demand for industries that don't exist. And so if you can foster those infant industries and dominate some of those supply chains, you're going to not only advance your development goals, but you'll get geopolitical advantage from that. And I think in a very, very macro way, that's one way to think about why China decided to invest in a renewable energy manufacturing complex, especially solar electric vehicles. China had many reasons to do this. This was not the only one. But yeah, it has proven to be quite smart. And as the global energy transition accelerates, and we should all hope that it does, China will increasingly find ways to get geopolitical advantages out of that. I don't think it will really help China's efforts to get bases in the Pacific, but it might help China's relationships with other countries, larger countries that want access to affordable and high quality autos, for example, that Chinese firms will be able to provide at a much, much better rate than Western makers. So this is going to be a different model than the development finance that we've been talking about in this talk, but I think it matters a great deal. And this is another reason not to underestimate the sophistication and the wisdom in many ways that undergird this Chinese strategy. It is, though cynical, I think probably going to turn out to work quite well.
So before we wrap up, let me remind you, we will meet again here in the Energy Policy Seminar a week from today, 12 o'clock in this room. Helene Binbenest will give a talk about migration and climate. Her talk is titled Climate Mobilities. So please join us for that. And finally, please join me in thanking Eyck Freymann for his talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.